On the morning of May 11, 1979, a frail woman died alone in her suite at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Los Angeles. She weighed less than 90 pounds. Her body was so emaciated that nurses had struggled for weeks to find veins for 5 needles. The woman who had once worn a 45-carat diamond on her finger could no longer lift her hand to her mouth. Barbara Hutton, heiress to the Woolworth Empire, had spent her entire life trying to buy something money could not purchase. Her fortune, once valued at over $50 million in 1933, had dwindled to less than $3,500. The woman who had owned palaces on 3 continents died in a rented hotel room with barely enough money to pay the bill. She left behind 7 failed marriages. She left behind palaces in Morocco and Mexico that she had abandoned years before. She left behind jewelry worth tens of millions that had been sold off piece by piece to pay for pills and hotel rooms. She left behind a son who had fallen from a window at age 53, though the official report called it a plane crash. She left behind poems published under pseudonyms that revealed the loneliness no amount of money could cure. She left behind a legacy that journalists would spend decades trying to understand. But most of all, she left behind a cautionary tale about the price of unlimited wealth and the impossibility of buying love. This is the story of a woman who had everything except what mattered most, a woman whose inheritance became her prison, whose beauty became her curse, and whose desperate search for love consumed the greatest fortune of the Gilded Age. A woman who was famous for being wealthy and wealthy for being famous, trapped in a cycle that would ultimately destroy her. From the Woolworth mansion on Fifth Avenue, to a lonely hotel room in Beverly Hills, from the glamorous parties of the 1930s to the isolated desperation of the 1970s, Barbara Hutton lived a life that seemed designed to prove that money cannot buy happiness. But her story is more complex than that simple moral. It is a story about childhood trauma that no amount of wealth could heal, about abandonment that no number of husbands could remedy, about a wound that opened in 1917 and never closed. If you enjoy stories of American wealth and the hidden cost of fortune, please subscribe to support me and my channel. You will not want to miss what comes next. Her story begins not with her birth, but with a death that would define her entire life. Edna Woolworth Hutton stood on the 18th floor of the Plaza Hotel on the morning of May 2, 1917. Below her, Fifth Avenue bustled with activity. Horse-drawn carriages competed with the new automobiles. Women in long skirts navigated the sidewalks. It was a beautiful spring day in New York City. Edna Woolworth Hutton was 33 years old. She was the daughter of Frank Winfield Woolworth, founder of the five-and-dime store empire that bore his name. She had married Franklin Laws Hutton, a wealthy stockbroker, in 1907. She had given birth to a daughter, Barbara, on November 14, 1912. She had everything a woman of her era was supposed to want. She also had something that terrified her, a mental illness that doctors could not name or cure. Today we might call it severe depression or bipolar disorder. In 1917 they called it a nervous condition. Edna opened the window. What happened next remains disputed. Some accounts claim she fell while reaching for something. Others suggest she suffered a sudden dizzy spell. The family insisted it was an accident. The newspapers knew better. Edna Woolworth Hutton plunged 18 floors to her death on May 2, 1917. Her daughter Barbara was 4 years old. The little girl was in the suite when it happened. Whether she witnessed her mother's death or simply heard the screams that followed, Barbara would never fully recover from that spring morning. The funeral was held at the massive Woolworth mansion at 2 East 81st Street. Frank Woolworth had built the French Renaissance-style palace in 1916 at a cost of $750,000. The house contained 40 rooms, a marble staircase copied from a chateau in France, and enough gilt to rival Versailles. Barbara stood at her mother's funeral in her best dress, not understanding that everything had changed. She had lost the one person who might have protected her from what was coming. She had lost her mother. She had gained something far worse: guilt. Even at 4 years old, some part of Barbara understood that she had been in the room. Some part of her, shaped by servants' whispers and her father's grief-stricken silences, began to believe she was somehow responsible. The thought would follow her for the next 62 years. Franklin Hutton was devastated by his wife's death. He was also a practical man. He had a daughter to raise and a career to maintain. He made a decision that Barbara would resent for the rest of her life. He sent her away. Barbara was placed in the care of her grandmother, Jenny Woolworth, and a rotating staff of governesses and tutors. She saw her father occasionally on weekends or holidays when his schedule permitted. She grew up in the Woolworth mansion, surrounded by servants but starved for affection. Her grandfather, Frank Woolworth, might have filled that void. He doted on Barbara in the early years. He called her his little princess. He gave her elaborate gifts and took her on tours of his stores. She was the heir to his empire, the continuation of his legacy. But Frank Woolworth's health was failing. The stress of building his empire had taken its toll. By 1919, he was spending more time in bed than in his office. He died on April 8, 1919, when Barbara was 6 years old. In the span of 2 years, Barbara had lost her mother and her grandfather. She had been abandoned by her father to the care of servants. She had inherited a vast fortune, but lost everyone who might have taught her how to bear it. The inheritance was staggering. When Frank Woolworth's estate was settled, Barbara received approximately $28 million. In 1919, that sum had the purchasing power of nearly $500 million today. She would receive the full amount when she turned 21. Barbara was now one of the richest children in America. She was also one of the loneliest. She lived in a mansion with 40 rooms, but no one to play with. She had governesses who taught her French and piano, but no one who held her when she cried. She had an absent father and a dead mother, and a fortune so large it made her a target for every fortune hunter in New York. The newspapers discovered her early. The press loved stories about wealthy families, and the Woolworths were among the wealthiest. When Barbara appeared in public, photographers followed. When she went to school, reporters wrote about it. When she sneezed, it made the society pages. She learned young that privacy was something money could not buy. Her father remarried in 1920. The new wife had no interest in becoming a mother to a grieving 8-year-old. Barbara remained with her grandmother, shuffled between the Woolworth mansion and various estates. Always surrounded by luxury, always emotionally abandoned, she began to understand something fundamental about her life. People wanted her money. They wanted access to the Woolworth fortune. They wanted to be close to wealth and power. But nobody seemed to want Barbara herself. This realization would shape every relationship she would ever have. To understand how she arrived at this devastating conclusion, we must understand the empire her grandfather built. We must understand the fortune that would become her curse. Frank Winfield Woolworth was born on April 13, 1852, in Rodman, New York. His family farmed poor land in Jefferson County. Money was scarce. Opportunity was scarcer. At 21, Frank took a job as a stock boy at a dry goods store in Watertown. He earned nothing for the first 3 months. It was an unpaid apprenticeship. When the store finally began paying him, he received $3.50 per week. Frank Woolworth had no particular genius for retail. What he had was an idea. A simple idea that would change American shopping forever. In 1878, his employer tried an experiment. The store set up a table displaying items for 5 cents each. Everything on the table cost the same price. No haggling, no negotiating. Just 5 cents. The table sold out in hours. Woolworth saw the potential immediately. Most stores kept merchandise behind counters. Customers had to ask clerks for items. creating a barrier to impulse purchases. Most stores also haggled over prices, turning shopping into an exhausting negotiation. What if you eliminated both obstacles? What if you displayed everything openly where customers could touch and examine items themselves? What if every item had a fixed, clearly marked price? On February 22, 1879, Frank Woolworth opened his first store in Utica, New York. He called it the Great 5-Cent Store. Everything cost exactly 5 cents. The store failed within months. He tried again. On June 21, 1879, he opened a second store in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. This time, he added 10-cent items alongside the 5-cent merchandise. The store succeeded. Within a year, he was opening additional locations. By 1886, Woolworth had 7 stores. By 1895, he had 28. By 1900, he had 59. The formula worked brilliantly. Fixed prices meant faster sales. Open displays encouraged impulse purchases. Low prices brought in customers who had never shopped in traditional stores. Woolworth was selling items that cost him 2 or 3 cents for 5 cents. The margins were thin, but the volume was enormous. He was democratizing consumption. He was letting working-class Americans buy manufactured goods they could never have afforded before. He was also getting very, very rich. In 1909, Woolworth began acquiring and merging with competing chains. He bought out rivals and consolidated control. By 1911, he controlled over 300 stores in the United States and Canada. He decided to incorporate them all under one company. Woolworth Company was incorporated on January 1, 1912. It was capitalized at $65 million, making it one of the largest retail corporations in the world. Frank Woolworth owned most of the stock. His daughter Edna owned a substantial portion. His granddaughter Barbara stood to inherit it all. In 1913, Woolworth completed his greatest monument to himself. The Woolworth Building opened in Lower Manhattan on April 24th. At 792 feet tall, it was the tallest building in the world. It would hold that title for 17 years. The building cost $13.5 million to construct. Woolworth paid for it entirely in cash. No loans, no mortgages. He wrote a check for the full amount. The lobby featured marble walls, bronze fixtures, and a vaulted ceiling covered in mosaics. Newspapers called it the Cathedral of Commerce. Frank Woolworth maintained an office on the 24th floor. From his windows, he could see most of Manhattan. He could see the immigrants arriving at Ellis Island, many of whom would become his customers. He could see the construction of new subway lines that would bring shoppers to his stores. He could see the future of American retail, and he had built it. By 1915, the Woolworth Company operated over 1,000 stores. Annual sales exceeded $66 million. The company employed more than 40,000 workers. The red and gold Woolworth sign had become as recognizable as Coca-Cola, but the empire was taking its toll on its founder. The stress of managing such a vast operation wore on Woolworth's health. He suffered from various ailments that doctors could not clearly diagnose. His teeth, particularly, caused him constant pain. Dentists of that era recommended extraction. Woolworth had most of his teeth pulled. The procedure, or perhaps the infection that followed, affected his mental state. He began having paranoid episodes. He obsessed over details. He suspected his executives of stealing from him. His personality changed. His daughter Edna's mental health was also deteriorating. The nervous condition that would eventually drive her to that 18th floor window was worsening. Woolworth watched helplessly as his favorite daughter spiraled into depression. When Edna died in 1917, something broke in Frank Woolworth. He had conquered American retail. He had built the tallest building in the world. He had amassed one of the great fortunes of the Gilded Age, but he could not protect his daughter from herself. He withdrew from active management of his company. He spent more time in bed. His paranoia intensified. He began to believe that his servants were trying to poison him. He refused to eat food unless someone else tasted it first. On April 8, 1919, Frank Woolworth died in his mansion at age 66. The official cause was listed as septic poisoning from infected teeth. The newspapers wrote lengthy obituaries praising his business innovations and his impact on American retail. What they focused on most was his fortune and who would inherit it. The estate was valued at approximately $27 million in liquid assets, plus substantial real estate and stock holdings. After various bequests to family members and charitable organizations, the bulk of the fortune passed to Frank Woolworth's 3 daughters, one of whom was already dead. Edna's share went to her daughter, Barbara Hutton. At 6 years old, Barbara became one of the wealthiest children in the world. She would receive full control of the money when she turned 21. The fortune came with no guidance, no wisdom, and no emotional support. Just money. An almost incomprehensible amount of money. Barbara grew up in the shadow of that inheritance. By her teenage years, Barbara had developed into a striking young woman. She had delicate features, large, expressive eyes, and a fragility that made men want to protect her. She also had approximately $50 million waiting for her on her 21st birthday. The combination would prove catastrophic. Barbara Hutton turned 18 in 1930. The timing could not have been worse. America was sliding into the Great Depression. Banks were failing. Businesses were closing. Men who had been millionaires on paper in 1929 were selling apples on street corners by 1930. Barbara was attending school in New York and spending summers in Europe. She saw the breadlines in Manhattan. She read about the suicides of ruined financiers. She understood, in some abstract way, that the world outside her mansion was suffering. Inside the mansion, nothing had changed. The servants still served dinner on gold-rimmed china. The cars still waited to take her wherever she wished to go. The trust fund her grandfather had established continued to generate enormous returns despite the market crash. The contrast created a public relations disaster. In December 1930, newspapers reported that Barbara was planning an elaborate debutante ball for her 18th birthday. The party was to be held at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in New York. The guest list included 1,000 people. The budget was estimated at $60,000. The story broke at exactly the wrong moment. Unemployment had reached 15%. Breadlines stretched for blocks in every major city. Families were losing their homes. Children were going hungry. And Barbara Hutton was throwing a party that cost more than most Americans would earn in a lifetime. The backlash was immediate and vicious. Newspapers that had once fawned over the little princess now condemned her as a symbol of tone-deaf aristocracy. Editorial writers questioned how anyone could spend $60,000 on a single party while millions starved. Politicians used her as an example of everything wrong with American inequality. Barbara was stunned by the criticism. She had not planned the party. Her family and advisors had organized it. She had simply agreed to attend. But the public saw only a spoiled heiress living in obscene luxury while the nation suffered. The party was eventually canceled. The damage to her reputation was permanent. From that moment forward, Barbara would be a target. Every purchase, every vacation, every romantic relationship would be scrutinized and criticized. She had become America's most hated heiress. The experience taught her a painful lesson. Her wealth made her a prisoner. She could not live normally. She could not do anything without public commentary. She could not even give away money without someone questioning her motives. She retreated from New York. In 1931, she began spending more time in Europe. Paris, London, the French Riviera. In Europe, wealthy Americans were common enough that she attracted less attention. The Depression had not hit Europe quite as hard. At least not yet. It was in Europe that she met her first serious suitor. Prince Alexis Mindovani was Georgian royalty, or at least he claimed to be. His family had fled Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution. Whether his title was legitimate remained a matter of debate. What was not debatable was his handsomeness, his charm, and his complete lack of personal wealth. Alexis was part of a family of titled fortune hunters. His brother David had married silent film star Mae Murray. His brother Serge had married opera singer Mary McCormick. His sister Rusadana had married Spanish painter Jose Maria Sert. The Midavani siblings had perfected the art of marrying money. Alexis set his sights on the richest target in the world. Barbara was 19 when she met him. She was lonely, insecure, desperate for affection. Alexis was 33, sophisticated, and apparently interested in her rather than her money. At least that is what he told her. Her father, Franklin Hutton, immediately recognized Alexis for what he was: a con man, a fortune hunter, a man who had nothing to offer except a questionable title and considerable charm. He forbade Barbara from seeing Alexis. This was perhaps the worst approach he could have taken. Barbara, who had spent her entire childhood feeling abandoned by her father, now saw his interference as just another form of control. She decided to marry Alexis partly because she believed she loved him, and partly to spite her father. On May 20th, 1933, Barbara Hutton married Prince Alexis Midavani in Paris. She was 20 years old. She would not gain full control of her inheritance for another year, but her trust fund already provided her with an income of approximately $4 million per year. The prenuptial agreement was generous by any standard. Alexis would receive $2 million immediately. He would receive an annual allowance of $500,000. If the marriage ended in divorce, he would receive an additional $2 million settlement. For a man with no income of his own, this represented an excellent return on investment. The wedding made international headlines. Woolworth heiress weds Georgian prince, the papers announced. Society columnists gushed about the romantic union. A few skeptical reporters noted that the groom seemed far more interested in discussing his new cars than his new wife. The marriage lasted less than 2 years. Barbara discovered almost immediately that Alexis had married her fortune rather than her. He spent money compulsively. He bought cars, polo ponies, and expensive gifts for his mistresses. Yes, mistresses. Plural. Alexis maintained several affairs even during the brief marriage. When Barbara confronted him, he responded with indifference. He had what he wanted. The money was flowing. The allowance was generous. Why should he pretend to love her now that the wedding was over? Barbara filed for divorce in 1935. True to the prenuptial agreement, Alexis received his $2 million settlement. He used part of the money to buy a faster car. On September 4th, 1935, just months after the divorce was finalized, Alexis Midavani crashed his Rolls-Royce into a truck near Barcelona at high speed. He died instantly. Barbara had escaped her first marriage, but she had learned nothing from it. The pattern that would define her life was already established. She would meet a charming man. She would convince herself that this time it was real love. She would shower him with money. He would betray her. She would end the relationship and immediately begin searching for the next one. 7 times this pattern would repeat. 7 marriages, 7 fortunes given away, 7 men who took what they wanted and left. But we are getting ahead of the story. In 1935, Barbara was only 23 years old. She had her entire fortune and most of her life ahead of her. The worst was yet to come. After her divorce from Alexis, Barbara did what wealthy, heartbroken women of her era always did. She went shopping. Not for clothes or jewelry, though she bought plenty of both. Barbara went shopping for houses. In 1935, she purchased a mansion in London at 2 Grosvenor Square. The house had 30 rooms, a ballroom, and servants' quarters for a staff of 20. Cost? Approximately $250,000, plus another $100,000 in renovations. That same year, she bought a palace in Tangier, Morocco. The Sidi Hosni Palace sat on a hill overlooking the Mediterranean. The property included multiple buildings, elaborate gardens, and fountains inlaid with colored tiles. Cost? Unknown, but certainly over $1 million when renovations were completed. In 1938, she purchased a 50-room mansion in Palm Beach, Florida. Then a Park Avenue apartment in New York with 14 rooms. Then a house in Mexico. Barbara was collecting homes the way some people collect stamps. Each property required a full staff. Each staff needed to be paid year-round. Whether Barbara was in residence or not, the maintenance costs alone consumed hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. But she was still only spending the income from her fortune, not the principal. The trust fund was so large that she literally could not spend money faster than it generated returns. At age 25, Barbara Hutton had become trapped in a prison made of mansions, each one more isolated than the last. She was also collecting something else: husbands. In 1935, shortly after divorcing Alexis, Barbara met Count Kurt Haugwitz Reventlow. He was Danish, titled, and crucially seemed more refined than her first husband. Kurt came from actual aristocracy rather than the questionable Georgian variety. His family had real estates and a genuine lineage going back centuries. Barbara convinced herself this time would be different. Kurt seemed less interested in money. He had his own family wealth, modest though it was compared to hers. He actually spent time talking with her, rather than just about her bank accounts. They married on May 8, 1935, in Reno, Nevada. Barbara was divorced from Alexis for less than 3 months before she married again. The warning signs were already visible to everyone except Barbara herself. This marriage produced something the first had not: a son. Lance Reventlow was born on February 24, 1936. For the first time in her adult life, Barbara had someone who needed her for reasons that had nothing to do with money. She adored the child. Lance became her entire world. She lavished attention on him in ways her own parents never had with her. She was determined to be a better mother than Edna had been, to break the cycle of abandonment that had defined her own childhood. But being a good mother requires more than love and money. It requires stability. Barbara had neither. Her marriage to Kurt deteriorated quickly after Lance's birth. The Count had married Barbara partly for her money, though he had been more subtle about it than Alexis. Now that the marriage had produced an heir, Kurt began making demands. He wanted control over Lance's inheritance. He wanted a larger allowance. He wanted a title for Lance that would establish the boy as his legal heir under European law. Barbara refused. The fights grew worse. By 1938, the marriage was functionally over. They divorced in 1941 after years of legal battles over money and custody. Kurt received a $1.5 million settlement. More importantly, he retained custody rights to Lance. This would prove devastating. Barbara had money to give Lance everything material, but Kurt had legal control. Lance would grow up shuttled between parents, never quite belonging to either, raised by nannies and boarding schools. The pattern Barbara had experienced as a child was now being visited on her son. In 1942, Barbara married again. Her third husband was Cary Grant. Yes, that Cary Grant. The movie star, the Hollywood icon, the man whose face appeared on screens across America. On paper, this seemed like Barbara's best choice. Grant was successful in his own right. He was famous, charming, impossibly handsome. Surely he did not need her money. Surely this time it was real. The marriage was doomed from the start. Grant was at the height of his fame. Barbara was the world's most famous heiress. Neither could escape their public image. Every appearance together sparked newspaper coverage. Every dinner became a photo opportunity. They could not have a private life because their celebrity made privacy impossible. There was also the issue of control. Grant had built his career through meticulous control of his image. Barbara had spent her life being controlled by others. Neither could yield to the other. Both were too damaged by their pasts to build a functional future together. The marriage lasted 3 years. They divorced in 1945. Remarkably, Grant refused to take any money from Barbara. He was one of the few men in her life who actually did not want her fortune. But that did not mean the marriage was about love. Grant later admitted in interviews that he had married Barbara partly for the publicity. Their wedding had made front-page news. Their marriage had kept him in the papers during a time when he was between major film roles. He had used her, just in a different way. Barbara was now 33 years old. She had been married 3 times. She had one son she was losing to custody battles. She had houses around the world, but no home. She had unlimited wealth, but no purpose. The Depression was over. World War II had ended. America was entering a period of prosperity and optimism. Barbara entered a period of decline. She began drinking heavily. She started taking pills to sleep, pills to wake up, pills to manage anxiety. Her weight dropped. She had always been slim, but now she was becoming dangerously thin. The newspapers, which had once chronicled her romances, now documented her deterioration. They published photos showing her gaunt face. They ran stories about her increasing reclusiveness. They speculated about her mental health. The poor little rich girl nickname, which had started as sympathetic, now carried the weight of prophecy. But Barbara was not finished collecting husbands. She would marry 4 more times. Each marriage would be shorter and more disastrous than the last. Barbara's 4th marriage in 1947 was to Prince Igor Trubetskoy, a Russian aristocrat who had fled to Europe after the revolution. He was a playboy who divided his time between casinos and bedrooms. The marriage lasted less than 2 years. Her 5th marriage, in 1953, was to Porfirio Rubirosa, a Dominican diplomat who was famous for exactly 2 things: his numerous marriages to wealthy women and his legendary physical endowment. Newspapers called him the Dominican Casanova. This marriage lasted 73 days. It was long enough for Rubirosa to receive approximately $2.5 million in cash and gifts. Her 6th marriage in 1955 was to Baron Gottfried von Kram, a German tennis champion. This seemed more promising at first. Von Kram was cultured and refined, but he was also gay, and the marriage was essentially a business arrangement to provide cover for his sexuality. They divorced in 1959. Her 7th and final marriage in 1964 was to Prince Pierre Don Vin Nechampasak, a Laotian prince and artist. He was 20 years younger than Barbara. The marriage lasted 3 years. He received paintings, jewelry, and a substantial cash settlement. By 1967, Barbara had given away approximately $100 million to various husbands. That amount represented twice her original inheritance. Even her vast fortune had limits. But the money was the least of what she had lost. Her son, Lance, had grown up troubled and resentful. He had been caught between his parents' battles. He had been raised by servants and boarding schools. He had watched his mother marry and divorce, a parade of fortune hunters. He had inherited his mother's money, but also her emotional instability. In 1972, Lance Reventlow crashed his private plane in Aspen, Colorado. He was 36 years old. The official cause was listed as pilot error in bad weather. Barbara, who had lost her mother at age 4, now lost her son at age 60. The only person she had truly loved, the only relationship that had not been transactional, was gone. She withdrew from public life almost completely. She moved between her various homes but seemed to belong in none of them. She sold several properties. She gave away others. The Tangier Palace went to the city of Tangier. The Palm Beach mansion was sold. One by one, her collected palaces disappeared. Her health continued to deteriorate. The pills and alcohol had damaged her body. She barely ate. Her weight dropped below 90 pounds. She suffered several minor strokes. Her mind remained sharp, but her body was failing. The fortune continued to shrink. Not just from the settlements to husbands, but from decades of extravagant spending. The houses, the yachts, the jewelry, the servants, the cars. The maintenance costs alone had consumed millions. The the gifts to friends and relatives, the donations to charities, the poor investments, and the outright frauds. By the mid-1970s, Barbara's fortune had been reduced to a fraction of its original value. Adjusted for inflation, she still had several $1,000,000. But compared to the $50 million she had inherited and the hundreds of millions it should have grown to, she was nearly broke. She spent her final years moving between hotel suites in Los Angeles and Palm Springs. She could no longer maintain houses. She could barely maintain herself. The staff that had once numbered in the dozens was reduced to a single nurse and an assistant. The newspapers that had once obsessed over her romances now wrote pitying articles about the poor little rich girl. Grown old, they published photos showing a frail old woman who looked decades older than her actual age. They tallied up the money she had given away and the men who had taken it. What they rarely mentioned was the loneliness, the crushing, absolute loneliness of a woman who had spent her entire life trying to buy love and learning, again and again, that love cannot be purchased. Barbara Hutton died on May 11, 1979, at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Los Angeles. She was 66 years old. Her estate was valued at approximately $3,500. The woman who had inherited one of the great American fortunes died nearly penniless. The obituaries were predictable. They recounted her 7 marriages. They listed her houses and her jewelry. They calculated how much money she had spent and given away. They called her a cautionary tale about wealth and excess. What they rarely examined was the deeper tragedy. Barbara Hutton's story is usually told as a morality tale about money wasted. 7 husbands, $50 million squandered, a life of excess and poor choices. But that is not really her story. Barbara was never given a choice about being wealthy. At age 6, before she could possibly understand what it meant, she inherited more money than she could ever spend. That inheritance made her a target from childhood onward. Every friend, every suitor, every distant relative approached her with the fortune in mind. She never learned to trust because everyone in her life had ulterior motives. She never developed purpose because her money eliminated the need to work. She never found love because every man who claimed to love her ultimately revealed himself to be in love with her bank account. Her 7 marriages were not the cause of her tragedy. They were symptoms of a deeper wound. A wound that opened on May 2, 1917, when her mother opened a window on the 18th floor of the Plaza Hotel. Barbara spent 62 years trying to heal that wound. She tried to heal it with houses. She tried to heal it with husbands. She tried to heal it with jewelry and yachts and parties. She tried to heal it by giving away money to anyone who asked. None of it worked because the wound was not about money. It was about abandonment, about a little girl who lost her mother and was then emotionally abandoned by her father, about a woman who never learned what love looked like when it did not come with a price tag. The Woolworth fortune is often cited as Barbara's curse. But the real curse was simpler and sadder. Barbara Hutton spent her entire life desperate to be loved for herself, while living in a world that made it impossible for anyone to separate her from her money. She once wrote a poem under a pseudonym. The poem ended with these lines: "I have sought love in many forms, and found it wanting every time. I bargained at affection's door, but love cannot be bought or sold." She knew. She always knew. She simply could not stop herself from trying. Barbara Hutton's story is not about the dangers of wealth. It is about the impossibility of healing childhood trauma with adult solutions. It is about how money can provide everything except what matters most. It is about a woman who had the means to buy anything in the world except the one thing she desperately needed: someone to love her without counting the cost. The Woolworth building still stands in Lower Manhattan at 792 feet. It is no longer the tallest building in the world, but it remains beautiful. A testament to the empire Frank Woolworth built from 5-cent items. That empire made his granddaughter one of the richest women in America. It also destroyed her. If you found this story meaningful, please subscribe and share it. These forgotten stories of American history deserve to be remembered, not for the scandal, but for the humanity beneath the headlines. Thank you for watching.